In 1914, a quarter of the world was controlled by the British Empire, and the colonies were secured by Britain's supreme naval power. At the time, the British Army was quite small compared to the other European powers, but it was the only fully professional regular army in Europe, and the soldiers were highly efficient despite their small numbers. Fearing the expansion of German influence, Britain guaranteed Belgium's neutrality, meaning that an attack on Belgium was an attack on Britain, and all the corners of the global empire would join the fight. By 1910, the United States had become the world's leading industrial power. Though they remained neutral for the first few years of the war, American industry and finance played a major role. Initially, American reaction to the war was mixed. While the greatest number of immigrants in the States were from Britain, including Ireland, Germans were second, and there was sympathy for both sides. However, when the war began, Britain cut Germany's transatlantic cable, so all American reports of the war were routed through Britain, and only what was favourable passed the censors. Also, events like the sinking of the ocean liner Lusitania and the execution of Edith Cavell inflamed the American public, and the war with Germany soon loomed large. As the most multicultural of all the great empires, Austria-Hungary had 15 different language versions of its national anthem. While its internal workings, that often valued heritage over ability, left it somewhat in a state of decay by 1914, the empire still dreamed of expanding its influence throughout the Balkans and perhaps one day all the way to Persia. In 1908, Austria-Hungary had annexed Bosnia, making Serbia the next in line, and if Serbia fell, Russia would lose all influence in the Balkan region. Germany, and especially Kaiser Wilhelm II, dreamed of a greater colonial empire and a greater German hegemony in the concert of Europe. A big concern for Germany was the expansion of the Russian railway system. In 1914, German Chancellor von Bethmann-Hollweg stated that within 3 years, Russia would be able to mobilize troops so quickly that the German advantage in technology would not be able to overcome the Russian advantage in manpower. To win the war, they had to act quickly. What Germany feared was a war on two fronts, so their battle plan was to defeat France and then focus the entire German military might on the Russian Empire. The war had its origins in Europe, but while there was a lot of fighting within that continent, it was a global conflict from the beginning. At the start of the war, the Japanese Empire was already locking horns with Germany and China and the Pacific Islands. And when the Ottoman Empire, which stretched from the Balkans to the Persian Gulf, joined in late 1914, it truly became a world war. There were naval battles in the South Pacific and South Atlantic. Soldiers from every continent except Antarctica would fight. There were fronts in Persia, Mesopotamia, Libya, even the borders of India, and fighting all over Africa as European colonies changed hands. Towards the end of the war, the United States and Brazil would also join in the fighting. It was the first truly global war and the largest in history at the time. The sheer force of the German Spring Offensive in 1918 had stunned the British, pushing them back almost to Amiens before they could stop the Germans at the outskirts of the city. Amiens, as a logistics centre and railway hub, was vital to the British war effort and had to be held. The Germans captured the neighbouring village of Villiers-Bretonneux, and Amiens was bombed. But the German supply lines were stretched too thin to capitalise on their success, and a British-Australian counterattack drove them away. But the Germans weren't finished. On April 24th, a German A-7V tank appeared and broke through the British defensive lines, threatening Amiens. 3 British Mark IV tanks challenged it in the first tank-on-tank battle in history, and held them at bay long enough for a squadron of Whippet tanks to appear. They drove off the Germans, and the Amiens sector was saved. The chateaux of France were the traditional homes of the nobility. Some resembled villas, others were more like castles. During the war, many of these fell into German hands, which then would serve as luxurious quarters for generals and high-ranking staff. Captured enemy officers and ace pilots enjoying the privileges of rank and title were often housed in these salubrious retreats. However, as the war gathered pace and the front spread, many soon became the scenes of vicious battles. By 1918, many of them were in ruins, much like the old aristocracy itself. The German Spring Offensive, also known as the Kaiserschlacht, was a series of German attacks on the Western Front in the spring of 1918. Germany had a manpower advantage over the Allies since Russia had left the war following the revolution. But German High Command realized that this would disappear as millions of troops began arriving from the USA. If Germany were to win the war, they needed to strike immediately and strike hard. German stormtroops would lead the attack. This was the first use of German tanks and an artillery bombardment so massive it could be heard in London. The Germans broke through the Allied lines, advancing further than anyone had in the West since 1914. But as the weeks went on, they were unable to move supplies and reinforcements forward quickly enough to continue the advance. Though they had made great gains and inflicted devastating casualties on the enemy, they did not achieve final victory, and the German army was left exhausted and depleted. The Allies' 100 days offensive began with the Battle of Amiens. Their objective was to capture the vital railway hub at Sedan, beside the Meuse River. This location was vital for the German army to move supplies and support to its forces north of Verdun. The job of taking Sedan fell to the fresh American troops under the command of General Blackjack Pershing and to the French. They would supply artillery, tanks, and air support. The Germans held on grimly, but with their reserves dwindling, they had no choice but to withdraw. By November 5th, Allied artillery was within range of the railway lines. With 1.2 million American soldiers involved, the Meuse-Argonne offensive is to this day the largest battle in the United States military history. Though a success, it was enormously costly. The fighting in the heavily fortified terrain of the Argonne forest has been described as hell on earth, and for the Americans, it was the bloodiest battle of the war. The Battle of Caporetto in October 1917 nearly broke Italy. They took 300,000 casualties as German and Austro-Hungarian forces crashed into the Isonzo River Valley. 1 year later, the situation was different. The German army was in retreat, Bulgaria had surrendered, the Entente was pushing through the Balkans and the Middle East, and the Italian Army Chief of Staff had been sacked for his incompetence and replaced by Armando Diaz. Austria-Hungary was on the verge of collapse, and if Italy was to gain any territory, they would have to act swiftly before the war ended. Diaz launched a final offensive to capture Vittorio Veneto. The fighting was brutal, but eventually the combined Entente forces had the demoralized Austrians in full retreat. They took Trent and Trieste as the Habsburgs' empire began to collapse. The Armistice of Villa Giusti took effect on November 4th, 1918, and ended warfare on the Italian front, 4 days after the end of the last bloody battle of the Great War. Flying aces were the rock stars of World War I, knights of the sky, loved and admired around the world, receiving dozens of love letters a day, their pictures adorning the bedroom walls of millions of teenage girls. Their names are immortal: the Red Baron, Billy Bishop, Eddie Rickenbacker, Werner Voss, Oswald Bulk, Albert Ball, Max Immelmann, René Fonck, Georges Guynemer, Charles Nungesser, and more. They were perceived as true gentlemen, fighting man to man, with respect between pilots transcending borders. While that perception may have been somewhat true early in the war, by the later stages it was anything but that. Flying most often in formation and attacking with machine guns, the life expectancy of pilots was frequently measured in hours, and a perfect kill was when the enemy never saw you coming. Europe, before the Great War, is often described as tranquil and peaceful. But in the decades before the Great War broke out, there had been Balkan Wars, the Russo-Japanese War, terrorism, assassinations, and increasing demands for civil rights and self-governance throughout the empires. And so, when Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand was shot, at first it barely caused a ripple. In Britain and France, it was seen as just another political assassination in a far-off corner of Europe where things like that happened. It was certainly not a reason to go to war. But all the nations who went to war did have other reasons, and as it turned out, that assassination was the perfect foil to make the dominoes fall. Austria-Hungary wanted an empire to the Mediterranean. Russia wanted influence in the Balkans. Germany feared Russian economic expansion and also wanted a larger global empire. France wanted back the lands it had lost to Prussia. Britain wanted to curb German expansion, especially naval and colonial expansion, while preserving its own worldwide empire. Some leaders also saw war as a way to silence the protests and boost nationalism. But it wasn't just political. War was big business. Someone would have to supply the troops, to produce the weapons, ammunition, and uniforms. Those someones would make fortunes. It's no secret that the war created tens of thousands of millionaires, and it's no secret either that many business leaders urged their governments to war in 1914.
Ça va aller.
Stay nighty night and kiss me. Just hold me tight and tell me you'll miss me. While I'm alone and blue as can be.
They push, we push. Every once in a while, we push hard enough that the light breaks through the clouds, and a world beyond the war glimmers, just out of reach. The war is the world, and the world is the war. But behind every gun sight is a human being. We are those people. We are the jaded, and we are the naive. We are the honorable and the criminal. We are the bound for legend and the lost to history. We are the knights of the sky, the ghosts in the desert, and the rats in the mud.